I think having an outlet, like a hobby outlet in some capacity, I think is great. So for me, as you can see, I'm walking. I walk pretty much all day long. I play hockey 3 times a week, plus. Like for me, hockey is my therapy. It's my Zen moment. I don't know if you played hockey, but when you're playing hockey for an hour, because the game is so fast, you can't think about anything else. There are 0 thoughts going on in my brain when I'm playing hockey, like literally 0, because your brain is just focused on all of these moving parts.
I mean, even watching it, it's like you can't have other thoughts. You know,
Yeah.
It's bad for advertising because it's like, well, I can't think about your beer right now. Like I'm trying to find the puck.
Right. That's for you Canadians who know where the puck is, but that's a different story. Here in Toronto, we have streetcars. And my old boss said to me, he goes, Matt, investments are like streetcars. You can see one come in and chase after it and race to the corner, and you can get to the corner and we call them conductors, the streetcar driver will pull away and you missed it. But don't worry, just stand on the corner. There'll be another one coming by in a few minutes. In other words, be patient, don't have FOMO. There'll be another one coming down the road, whether it's 2 minutes from now or in 2 years from now. Just be patient.
Hello, welcome back. This is Alex Shartsis, and I'm pleased to be joined by Matthew Leibowitz of Plaza Ventures today. And I'd like to turn it over to Matthew to introduce himself.
Hey, Alex, thanks for having me. Matthew Leibowitz, co-founder of Plaza Ventures, based out of Toronto, Canada. We've been around for almost 12 years now. We started off investing in Series A and Series B companies, and over the last number of years, moved a little bit later stage to focus on Series B, Series C, and mainly doing secondary transactions. Very unique, bespoke type transactions. Here primarily in the Canadian ecosystem, but we've also invested in the United States and in Israel.
Awesome. So one of the reasons I was really excited to bring Matthew on the podcast, besides being hard to get because he doesn't do a lot of these podcasts, is because the fund is just unique. Like it does something that's very specific. And I think from a go-to-market standpoint, it's great to talk to people who really know their lane and focus. And also from founders, like it's a very founder-friendly approach to investing. And so I think it's really useful for founders to understand the full universe of what's out there so that they can get a better sense for what their options are. Their options are not always just the traditional Series A, Series B, Series C. And so as a starting point, maybe it'd be good just to talk about your journey, Matthew, and how you started the fund and then evolved the fund into what it is today.
Sure. So I came into venture very differently, I think, than many people in that I've actually already been doing this for 17 years. It was really the first job that I had, which didn't involve me picking something up and moving it somewhere else. And so right out of school, after the various universities that I went to, I got hired right into VC and never looked back. So I've been in VC my entire effectively professional career. And things have evolved significantly in the last 15 plus years. As you can imagine, the ecosystem is completely different than what it was like when I first got into the ecosystem. But I basically spent the first 4 or 5 years with my head down and my eyes and ears open and my mouth shut. I was like a sponge. I just wanted to learn everything and just worked. And it was great. And it was a great opportunity for me to just absorb and try to read the landscape, understand structures, understand what to look for, because as we all know, with VC, a lot of it is pattern recognition. What works in this company might work in another company. And so just trying to understand those patterns, I think, was a big important aspect of the first number of years of my career.
Yeah. What sort of fund were you at for that portion of your career? Was it all one fund or did you move between funds?
Nope. I was at one fund. And actually I started my career on the venture debt side of it. So we were a lender. We were one of the pioneers in the lending space to kind of mid-stage-ish Canadian tech companies, mainly Canadian tech companies. And I am very, very grateful that I started my career on the lending side versus the equity side, because it taught me never to get what I call romantically invested or involved with a company. And my old boss taught me the magic words, which were, "Can you pay me back?" And that was really what we were looking for. So we would have companies come into our office, especially in these days, and they would say, "We're the next Google, we're the next Facebook, we're the next ... And we would go, "Great, can you pay me back?" And that was really what we were looking to do. And it really taught me how to underwrite a company. It really taught me how to focus on one hand, unit economics and management's ability to execute on the other hand. And it's really that merger of the two that really helped me school me in what I look for. And I'm really appreciative that that's how I started my career versus just doing pure, early equity and taking big bets and trying to take big swings.
Yeah, what's interesting when you transition as a founder or an investor, but especially as a founder from that early stage, is you go from having to tell a great story, right? And do enough arm waving to make it look like you can execute against the story you're telling, to a point where you've been doing it for 3 or 4 years. And so there's a history that people can look at and expectations of what you said you would do. Maybe you've talked to people every quarter, every 6 months over the last couple of years, and what you said you do and whether you did it or not. And I think it's easy to lose sight of that, especially in a frothy market like we had a couple of years ago, where if you were in a hot space, more equity investors would just show up and bang on your door and want to invest. But I think in the current market, I'm curious for your take on this. In the current market, it's much more fundamental driven, and any investor, even the equity ones, are going to be a lot more focused on what are the unit economics. Are you going to still be in business a year from now?
I think that is very true in this current environment. And I've fortunately been around long enough to see a couple of these cycles. Now, this isn't my first rodeo. What I will say is that the collective we, generally have short memories.
That's true. That's true.
And
crypto's back, by the way. Bitcoin is 47,000.
It's huge.
Let's go.
And so I wouldn't be surprised if tomorrow morning things change again at the drop of a hat. And so I do believe that people are focusing more on quote unquote fundamentals right now. But I think that again could change at a moment's notice, because there'll be a new quote unquote thing that arises that the LPs and the VCs will want to now focus on strategically. I mean, just think about everything that's going on with AI and all of that right now. And so you just never know. But having said that, for folks like us, we tend to, for lack of a better term, stay away from a lot of that hyperbole and just focus again on companies with very strong unit economics and again, management's proven ability to execute.
Right. Well, so let's talk about your current fund and what you do there, because I think that it's really interesting and people should know both that it exists, you personally in your fund, but also that type of financing exists.
Yeah, well, thank you. So I think the hard part about explaining us is we don't have a good elevator pitch, in the sense is that it's not easy to explain what we do and why we do it and how we do it, because we do a lot of different things a lot of different ways. In other words, we're not kind of like a one size fits all. We're the exact opposite. And in fact, every deal we do is typically quite bespoke. And that's based on our many years of doing deals, is that you realize after a bit of time that not everyone can get shoehorned into doing one thing one way. And so we kind of adapt to whatever the circumstances requires, providing that we're interested in investing in that company, i.e. we can make it work many different ways. In fact, I would argue our superhuman strengths are structuring, are identifying companies and structuring a deal to make sure that it makes sense for us and most certainly for the other folks around the table, i.e. the management teams and the other shareholders in the business.
So maybe it helps to go through some examples. Obviously, if you need to leave the company names out, but like what's a sort of, I'm a founder, I come to you because in my network, you don't have a huge public persona on purpose. Yeah. But somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, I have this, financing need." Like what are the typical needs that somebody would come ask you about?
So imagine 3 people started a company half a dozen years ago. The company's doing pretty well now. It's growing. One of the 3 people who started the company is no longer involved. He or she now works for Google or whatever, started their own company, moved out of the country for family reasons or whatever the case may be. And that person is sitting on their shares and which on paper is hopefully worth a lot of money, but actually they haven't made actual dollar in their jeans in their pocket. And they're looking for some liquidity. Again, maybe they want to start their new business, they want to buy a new house, they want to pay off their mortgage, whatever the case may be. Or their parents, invested as a friends and family kind of thing, and they're looking for some liquidity because they're getting older and they want to do some family or estate planning, whatever the case may be. And so from that perspective, we will come in and structure an investment with that individual or individuals to help provide that liquidity for them. Everything done under the aegis of the CEO. The CEO, in almost 100%, if not 100%, of the transactions is the quarterback of the deal that we do. It's generally CEO-led to help provide some liquidity for some of their shareholders. So that is, I would say, a fairly typical down the fairway type transaction that we do. And then what we then find is that once we kind of get into a company, whether we're on the board as a director or observer or advisor, it's really imperative for us to build that relationship. And what we find is that we generally invest anywhere between 2 and 7 times in the company throughout the entire life cycle of a company. And that's pretty typical for us. So I call it kind of toehold investing, where we start relatively small, where initially into a company, and then objectively over time, we'll do another 2 or 3 investments, whether they be acquisition financings, additional liquidity for shareholders in the form of secondary, primary rounds, convertible notes, you name it. We're kind of, again, open to different structures and providing the kinds of financing that make most sense for the company at that moment.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because that you get a lot of founder disputes, exactly as you described, where there's one founder who left, is getting a nice salary somewhere, and they're either pushing on their former co-founders to get an exit or do something to free up the cash, or there's some bitterness because, hey, you left, like you have a third of the company or 20% of the company, and you're not doing anything, and we're doing everything, and you just get 20% of our hard work. So I feel like this probably comes up not infrequently.
I think it happens more often than people talk about or acknowledge or realize, especially when they're starting a company, that you got to realize that typically when you build a business, it's a 10, 12-year process. And the person or the people that started the company on day one might not be the same people that end with the company in 10 or 12 years from now or 7 years from now, whatever the case may be. Things change. Life happens.
Part of me is like, well, if you leave as a founder, it'd be great to just cash you out. Just be like, great, this is where you got the company. This is where things are. How about you just take your money and go do something else now and leave the equity for the rest? Obviously, that's a bit naive as a perspective, but on some level, it's sort of like more fair in some respects than having a big chunk of equity and going and working for Google.
Yeah, and people leave companies for all sorts of reasons and under different circumstances. So there's no guarantee when you start a company, as we all know.
Right.
It's a long and rocky and hair-raising and exciting path, and it's never a linear path ever, even in the best companies. And so from that perspective, you just never know what's going to happen. And I think to know that there's alternatives for folks out there, knowing that you're not just sort of your typical Series A, Series B investor, not that there's anything wrong with that, just there's other folks doing other sorts of transactions out there. So I think that's really the niche that we kind of look towards or fill.
Yeah, and I'm curious, like you mentioned the CEO being the quarterback of the process. What are they feeling, or what are you solving a problem for the CEO specifically as much as you are for that third founder who left, or the board, or something?
So the problem isn't so much for the CEO per se, in that they're really looking to do more of a quote unquote favor for their shareholder, whether it be their ex-co-founder, or my other joke is that I use is that it's the CEO's mother's neighbor who's a dentist who put in $20,000 8 years ago. It's like they're trying to provide liquidity for someone who was one of their early backers, or an ex-employee who joined them in the early days, right? It's not so much that they need to, it's a nice to have versus a must have, typically in the situations that we're involved with. I can use another example where there was a co-founder of an existing portfolio company that we had already invested in multiple times. And he had, I'll put it to you this way. He was dealing with some real estate issues, some personal real estate issues. Okay. And the CEO, his co-founder, who we have a very great relationship, and like you said, we've invested in this company many times, came to me and said, Matt, you're the only one on my cap table that I think can solve this problem and do it quickly. This other company has very, very large global institutional investors on their cap table that could easily have written the check in terms of the check size and this, that, and the other, but none of them could actually, A, get their head around it, and B, structure a deal, and C, execute in that sort of finite period of time. So he came to me and we got it done. And we got it done at a significant discount to the last round. And the co-founder was absolutely thrilled. He called me up and couldn't thank me more than my team and I, because we helped them out of an enormous jam, personal jam as a result of that. And then even at the next board meeting, which I think was maybe a few days later, the CEO gave me a shout out for, sort of stepping in kind of thing and helping out the co-founder. It's things like that again are a little bit different, but I actually think provide a lot of value in the context of a business.
And who knows what the personal real estate issues would have cost him if he couldn't have gotten the liquidity to figure it out. I guess, when you say fast, I think a lot of people don't appreciate how slow or fast investors move. If you're early stage, you're used to angel investors where they write you a 25 or 100K check and you have 1.5 hour meeting and they send the wire later that same day. Whereas when you get into the institutional world, like large global institutions, it can take months, if not longer, from a yes to cashing the check. What is the time frame that you see for deals that you work on?
It totally depends. Again, there's no quote unquote standard deal, but this particular transaction, we had the benefit of being an existing investor and being a board observer for many years. So the quote unquote diligence was already done in that regard. So we didn't have to do a full quote unquote workup on the company like it was a net new investment. We had that level of comfort there, and the company's tracking extraordinarily well. And we had the dry powder, in our funds ready to go. So that deal, the whole thing from soup to nuts was maybe like 10 days kind of thing.
It's funny. The deals that take 4 months and drag out, those are the ones you remember. When it's like, 10 days, you probably like, it was fast. Like I don't have to think about it much because we got it done.
It was fast. And what also gave us comfort is that the co-founder who sold was only selling, a very small portion of his shares. This wasn't like him selling 60%, 70% of his shares in the company. He's still very much integral to the business and a great guy. So we wanted to do, again, something that made a lot of sense to solve his problem, but also gave us enough upside to structure something that made sense for us as well, too.
That's great. You mentioned being on the board, you're having a driver's seat and following the company for a while. Can we talk for a minute just about that evolution of CEOs? I mean, it sounds like you've been with these companies for 5 years, 7 years in some cases.
Yeah.
And you also had that early experience of investing earlier in your career. What do you see as kind of best practices CEOs do, or what are things to do and what are things to avoid?
So the list of best practices is pretty short.
Really?
and the list of things to not do is also pretty short. It's pretty simple. My view of it is that the best founders over-communicate with their shareholders, with their investors. Whether it be a quick 10-second text, a quick 2-minute phone call, a weekly, monthly, whatever you want to call it, email. Those CEOs, specifically I'm talking to CEOs, that can over-communicate and not be afraid of hiding issues, because we all have egos. We all are a little bit nervous that, oh my goodness, I've raised all this money and it hasn't worked out the way what the hell is good. We've all been there. We're all adults, I think, I hope, and we should all be able to live with the consequences. And I think if you communicate whatever the issues are, good, bad, or ugly, then we could just deal with the reality of whatever that situation may or may not be. So one of my mantras for 2024 is to really be over-communicative, just across the board, whether it be with my wife, my kids, my CEOs, you name it. I'm really just trying to keep all levels of communication very open and very, for lack of a better term, basic. There's certainly best practices around this, that, or the other, but like it's all relative to the specific company. So to me, the core principle is just being honest and very open with communication.
Great. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, people obsess with, I need metrics. I need OKRs, right? you can come up with metrics and OKRs that are more transparent and better help your communication, or you can come up with ones that obscure your company's performance or lack thereof. And I think the principle of just being honest is a good one.
And that to me is what it all comes down to.
Yeah. And so, I mean, obviously being dishonest is what to avoid.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It's a relatively short list of what to do and what not to do. Like, don't be dishonest. Just be honest with what's going on. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, I mean, on a practical level, let's say a CEO has bad news. I mean, this comes up all the time. It comes up with my clients. My advice is always exactly the same. Like your investors will like you more if you go to them with the bad news as soon as you find out about it. Not, hey, let's wait a week until I figured out how to solve it, right? But what is your take on that? Like when should somebody come to a board member or an investor in their cap table with bad news?
I mean, my off-the-cuff answer would be come to me as soon as possible, as humanly possible. Or the other answer is deal with it. And then maybe you've solved the problem. And then maybe tell me about it. We had this big thing happen over here, or this thing happened over here. But don't worry, I dealt with it. We're good to go. I just want to let you know this happened, and we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again, and we've addressed it, or whatever the case may or may not be, So there's kind of two schools of thought to think about it. Just call your investor and go, or your friend, your advisor, your whomever, and go, oh my God, this is happening. What do we do? Or actually, no, I've dealt with it and we're good to go. So there's no right answer to either of those scenarios. But don't get me wrong, I do really not having to do the work on it or having to stress it. And I'm not, if I had my ideal choice, it would be the CEO addressed the problem and dealt with it and it's done and then told me about it versus I had to deal with it. I just don't want to do it. That's the difference between being an operator and an investor. I think correct.
There is a line, right? I think if it's something that's like, hey, this whatever HR issue came up, we dealt with it, right? It took a day, but it took a lot of my attention. Makes total sense not to bring your investors in until you're through it. I think if it's going to drag for a couple months, right? You don't want to wait the couple months and then say, this bad thing happened, right?
Sure. If it's, I lost my biggest customer and we're going to lose 60% of our revenue this year, and they just terminated our contract for whatever reason, and now my entire model is upside down, then we should be talking in real time as quickly as possible.
Yeah, not until you filled the pipeline and found the 60% of revenue.
Correct.
I'll just tell them once I close these other 3 enterprise deals so that I can say that we're back on track. Right?
And that's the difference that I'm referring to. So you hit the nail on it. If it's some, quote unquote, relatively minor, hopefully HR issue versus, oh my God, we've lost our biggest customer. Those are materially different things to come to me with, right?
Yeah. Well, so let's talk a little bit about how you, when a company comes to you, what are you looking for? Because I think it's different than your typical, like you said before, right? Will you pay me back? Or can you pay me back? So, what is it that you look for a little bit deeper than that so that people can kind of understand where I need to get to?
The first thing I've realized is that, which I only came to the realization about this a couple years ago, no schmucks. That's rule number one, no more schmucks. For many years, and this is something that many of my friends and colleagues have heard me say over the last couple of years, but I felt for the first 15-ish years, I was shoveling and eating dog crap just on a daily basis because we were all starting our careers. We were all building our businesses. We were all trying to make, quote unquote, make a name for ourselves, build a brand, establish yourself. And so you kind of take whatever comes your way, for lack of a better term. Right. And then a couple years ago, I had this kind of epiphany right at the height of COVID. I was like, you know what? I'm done with schmucks. No more. I don't, there's too much going on this planet.
What is a schmuck? Like what makes someone?
People who lie, people who overstate things, people who are lazy, people who don't fulfill or hold up their end of the bargain, regardless of how big or how small that their portion of the deal may or may not be. People who say they're going to do something and don't do it. That is something that really, frankly, irritates me.
It's tough, especially, early on, there's a bit of fake it till you make it in most startups. And I think
absolutely
at some point you have to outgrow that and just be, hopefully honest. You can make it without faking it. But at some point you've got to walk the walk and stop talking the talk.
Yeah, and I'm not just talking about CEOs. I'm talking about in life,
True.
Overall. Like, this is not just about work. This is just my new-ish philosophy about life. Like, I don't care anymore. Like, that's enough. Like, I did it for a long time, and now I don't want to do it. And I've never been happier, more productive, and more successful as a result. I don't think it was a direct result of saying I'm done with schmucks, because there was however many decades of work and life leading up to that decision that have resulted in where I am today. But that certainly contributed to getting at peace with a lot of business.
I think there's something deeper in there, because you talk about early in your career, you just had to deal with it, right? You needed the experience, you needed the reps. It was just sort of shoveling crap the whole time. For me, a big unlock when I was CEO was stopping to need stuff, like needing another customer, needing another investment, needing whatever. And I think if you let go of needing things, then you can let go of having to deal with schmucks, right? I think if you feel like, I need, this is a hot company, it's in a hot space, like I need to make this investment. I really don't like the founder that much, but I need the customer. I need this in the LP presentation, whatever that is. When you let go of that and you don't need it anymore, then you can make a better choice for yourself. And that opens up other choices.
I agree. And I was joking with my partner, Daniel, right before Christmas. Sometimes you try to kick open every door that's in front of you. Not even just open it nicely. You try to just head first ram that door down. I think a lot of entrepreneurs kind of take that bull in a china shop approach. And that was kind of me for the first 10 years of starting Plaza Ventures. It was like every door I was trying to bust open head first. And I don't regret a second of it. I would do it all again. And going back 12 years from now, I would do it all again, because I don't regret any of it. It was all, quote unquote, a learning experience. And again, was all, I believe, a step function to where I am today and where I'm going tomorrow. So I'm not saying don't be that guy or that person. I'm just saying, for me, I made a fundamental change a couple years ago to, like you said, be a little bit more selective of who I work with, who I do business with, who I spend my time with. And I think that has been a big sea change in my overall way that I look at the world. I think it's been really beneficial to me.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to shift gears a little bit to the boardroom, because you spend a lot of time on the boards and observing boards. And is there anything that you wish CEOs would ask their board members for more often, or that they're missing out on? What is that?
So board meetings, in my humble opinion, they generally last about 2.5 to 3 hours. I find, unfortunately, that most board meetings become more of the CEO educating the board on the business and the product, versus using it as an opportunity to have very strategic discussions with their board members, whether they be investors, independent board members, advisors, you name it. And so usually, like, the important stuff is saved for the end. And then you're like, everyone's looking at their watch going, okay, I got to get out of here. And you've left yourself 15 minutes to actually talk about the things that truly matter to the strategic direction of the business, which is really one of the primary functions of the board of directors. So what I try to do with my management teams is that I ask them to send me their board decks at least 3 or 4 days in advance of a board meeting. And my team and I do something that I call flags: green flag, red flag, yellow flags. I read every board deck. I make notes. My team will go through the deck and make notes, i.e. flags, good, bad, or ugly. And we kind of consolidate it into a little mini deck so that they're educated with asking the right questions, the collective questions of our group, so that we're there to ask questions and solve problems versus tell me about the product this week or what's related. I should know that well in advance going into the board meeting. So I think it's about making board meetings more effective versus what can the CEO do better. Now, that all, in my humble opinion, starts with the CEO. The CEO has to be the driver of these initiatives, because I don't think too many of the board members will kind of come up with these kinds of ideas, for lack of a better term. I think if the CEO will drive an agenda whereby each board member comes prepared with questions, I think is amazing. And then I also think that the CEO should then have 5 asks of their board members for each board meeting as well too. What can each person or sitting around the table contribute over the next little while? What are those 5 things that you need? It could be, I need an accountant. I need a new VP sales. It could be, I'm looking to go on vacation. What do you recommend? and anything and everywhere and anything and everything in between. So coming prepared to the meeting and then making the asks, I think is really the objective of how a good board meeting should be run.
That's great, and echoes advice others have given. I think it's easy to let the board meeting get away from you as a CEO and not be intentional about it. I think it's great advice. You've dealt with a lot of CEOs, deal with them every day. What are the vacation thing, was interesting because I think people underestimate the importance of, personal connection, also professionalism, right? So having that well-run board meeting with a strict agenda where you actually get stuff done and aren't just pontificating is really important. But there's also interesting differences of opinion on CEO or founder burnout and just the personal aspect of being a founder and going on that founding journey. Do you have any thoughts on sort of how the founders that you've seen succeed and last, what they do differently, or just anything in terms of that personal journey for the CEO?
I think having an outlet, like a hobby outlet, that's not necessarily part of running your business, or that maybe it's somewhat tangential to the business, I think is really important to have an outlet in some capacity, I think is great. So for me, as you can see, I'm walking. I walk pretty much all day long.
That's great.
I play hockey 3 times a week, plus. Like for me, hockey is my therapy. It's my Zen moment. Because I don't know if you played hockey, but when you're playing hockey for an hour, because the game is so fast, you can't think about anything else. Like I'm not thinking about, there are 0 thoughts going on in my brain when I'm playing hockey, like literally 0. Because your brain is just focused on all of these moving parts. And so for me,
hockey's such a fast move. I mean, it's not as popular here in California as it is in Canada, but it's such a fast moving game that, I mean, even watching it, it's like you can't have other thoughts. It's bad for advertising because it's like, well, I can't think about your beer right now. Like I'm trying to find the puck.
Right. That's for you Canadians who know where the puck is, but that's a different story.
I'm still trying to figure out what icing is. That's like the craziest rule.
That's a whole other podcast. No, so for me, hockey is that outlet that I have where my brain just goes to 0 to just play hockey. I'm not thinking about work. I'm not thinking about my family. I'm not thinking about anything else on the planet aside from just not getting my head crushed while I'm playing hockey. And so that to me is my personal outlet. And so I would encourage my CEOs to find their outlet for them where they can remove themselves for, pick your time, however many times a week or however long in a day, to have that time to just go away and turn their brain off. And then hopefully they come back energized. And so, for example, I played hockey last night. I played Tuesday night. Last night I got home at, just before 11 p.m. I was on my laptop, until 12:30 last night, as soon as I got home working.
You probably can't sleep after.
No, you're wired. Your body is going, right? So the adrenaline's going. But I would encourage them to also reach out to other CEOs that are kind of like similar stage type companies, because I think learning from your peers and engaging with your peers is actually a really amazing thing to do. So I'm very close with a lot of my other VC friends, colleagues, peers, whatever you want to call them, specifically here in Toronto. Very, very close. I consider some of them some of my best friends, actually. And we're constantly getting together. I host dinners. I host breakfasts for people all the time, once, twice a month. And so I find that having those strong relationships with people who are in your world, but perhaps where you're not necessarily directly competitive to because you don't want to step on each other's toes, so that friction isn't there, is actually really, really beneficial as well too. So the other thing that I would just add is just for me, there's a personal level, it's not for everybody, it's just having just so much joy with my wife and my kids is really the best thing that I have going on in my day. So for the most part, so just having an amazing family to just hang out with is really great too. It helps you really focus. I became a much better investor when I became a father. I'll put it to you that way.
Yeah, it's interesting because I remember a founder early in my career was like, "Oh, I don't know if I want to work with you because you have kids, and so you're not going to be able to work as And I was like, are you crazy? Like, are you, you
it's
get
the
so
exact
much more
opposite.
focused. Yeah.
It's the exact opposite. You because you don't have the time, or your time is allocated in other ways. The time that you are at quote unquote work, because work, as long as you have a phone, you're probably working 24/7 anyways. But the time that you're dedicated to work is you're hyper focused. At least I am, because I know that 3 hours from now, I got to pick my son up and take him to his hockey game, which is going to be 3.5 hours out of my evening, kind of thing. So I need to be able to focus my time accordingly. And by the way, I'm taking a Zoom call from the arena when he's there. So you just got to be able to allocate your time accordingly and make sure that you're being efficient as well.
Yeah, no, it's great advice. So two questions. One, just about Canadian VC, because you're the first Canadian general partner that we've had on the podcast. Is it different in any meaningful way than US VC? Is anything people should consider?
Here's where I get in trouble.
You can decline it. You can say no comment if you want, but I'm just curious. Like, it is every pocket of venture is different culturally, and
it's culturally different here in Canada. Very. To be honest with you, the scale is not nearly as large, to say the least, as it is in the US. It's a fraction of what it is in the United States. Having said that, there are more Canadian VCs now who are getting more actively engaged and investing in the United States and abroad, which is a relatively new phenomenon. We didn't really see that too much. Historically, most Canadian VCs have been focused on the Canadian domestic tech market, but that's starting to change now as the funds are getting larger and getting more global in nature. And I think that's a really, really positive change to see for the Canadian venture ecosystem. Like you said, every pocket is a little bit different, but I think we at Plaza Ventures have more of a, for lack of a better term, American approach or mentality to working with our companies versus some of the others in the ecosystem. We just think about the world a little bit differently and do deals a little bit differently than your typical, quote unquote, typical $100 million plus Canadian venture fund. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Those guys are wonderful people, but it's just a different kind of mentality.
Is there anything different in terms of the interaction as a founder one would have with the Canadian fund or US fund, or is it basically, venture investors or venture investors?
I think the benefit, we generally have smaller funds, so the bets that we take have to materialize. We don't have as much room for error. So I think there's that alignment there, that pressure on the Canadian VCs to have those winners. I don't want to say is greater, but just from a data perspective is heightened, is more impactful. So I think that relationship is really important. And the Canadian VC eco, or I should say the Canadian tech ecosystem, is still a relatively small ecosystem. It's big comparatively, but certainly compared to the US, it's, like I said, much smaller. So I think people generally get along quite well in Canada. We're also Canadians. So Canadians generally get along with most people, but we want to play nicely, So I find Canadian VCs, and again, this is hard to stereotype, but generally will play nicely. The market here is not competitive. I'll put it to you this way. I don't think in my 12 years of running Plaza Ventures, we've quote unquote lost a deal to a competitor, i.e. been outbid on a term sheet, outstructured.
Time here.
I know.
It's just a normal Tuesday.
Correct. And so I think if I'm investing in a company and I find out that there's, one or two other VCs at the table that are Canadian, chances are the partner there is a good friend of mine. And I'm going to call him or her up and be like, okay, so are we doing this? What do you think? And that's generally how the ecosystem works. Versus in the US, it's so much more competitive.
Yeah, there's aspects of both. I think early on, back in like the pre-2010 era, there was a bit of that more collaborative nature, but now there's so many funds, and
exactly,
especially in that $100-200 million seed stage, that when you get into the second tier of them, they're just very hungry for deals. So, everybody's trying to make their way, and it's sort of the nature of the market. But
so we don't really have that here. The other thing that I think is also different is that we don't really have like the super angels. We don't really have, I think really what separates the Valley and places like Tel Aviv apart from many other ecosystems, including Toronto/Canada, is that you have entrepreneurs that have made their money from the tech industry. In Canada, we certainly have that. Don't get me wrong. There's plenty of people who have been very, very successful in technology and in VC. But you have had multiple, almost generations of that now. We have not had that. That is a relatively new phenomenon. So you have this notion of the super angel in the Valley or in New York or in Tel Aviv that can personally fund, or with a few of their friends, get a company up and running for the first number of years of its existence. In Canada, that is exceptionally rare. So I think that is also one of the big differences as well. So
yeah, I mean, for Americans, I've pitched super angels and taken investments from some, and it's very, to go into a pitch and have one decision maker that can write you a $2 million check or a $5 million check, and then call Bezos and say, Jeff, you're investing too, is
pretty awesome.
It's pretty awesome, yeah. And I think, it creates its own problems because they have their own motivations, right? They're already billionaire. They don't really care. They care on some level whether you're successful, but it's different than a GP in a fund who's betting their career on you.
Right.
Right. Their career's, for all intents and purposes, already a win, and they're, this is their second or third career. So it's a different vibe, but I think it's interesting what that does to the ecosystem, right? It probably makes it a little bit more egalitarian.
I think it does. And that's why I'm saying it's a little bit more collaborative here, right? We all kind of have to be friends because we all know each other. We all see each other at the same conferences. We all, most VCs have a similar LP base. So everyone is trying to be much more friendly, I think. I think that's a general rule that you see here in Canada.
So last question, and then we should get to the wrapping up questions. What, you see a lot of senior hires. So when you're looking at, I know that you've said, before in the green room that you don't really focus on go-to-market because that's just not where you play in the ecosystem. But when you think about the team composition, when you're talking to a CEO about a first investment, talk to me a little bit about go-to-market as it's reflected in the management team and how you think about it at a company level.
Yeah, I think it also depends on the management team. Are they the founders and what their roles were when they were the founders? Were they a technical founder? Were they more the quote unquote business founder? Were they more the sales founder? Really it just depends on what the current, by the time that we invest, the current iteration of the management team looks like. Generally, when we invest, they have churned through 1 or 2, 3 sales teams. And the current team is hitting their quotas and they kind of have their unit economics down and they have that, for lack of a better term, playbook in their back pocket ready to go and it's working. That is really one of the things that I look for. And there's no rhyme or reason or hard and fast rule in terms of what that playbook is, because I think for every company is a little bit different. Again, I think if you look at our portfolio, it's a complete mixed bag of the types of companies that we invest in. We don't just do SaaS. We don't just do enterprise. We're all over the map in terms of the types of companies that we invest in. Again, I spend more time thinking about how the company does things versus what they actually do, if that makes sense. So for me, by the time that we're typically investing, that playbook should be well entrenched and executed upon. Having said that, I think the CEO's number one job is to be listening to his or her customer. Your customer it begins and ends with your customer, full stop. Obviously, your employees, but
because without the customers, you don't have employees. So
you got nothing. So for me, I love when my CEOs get on the road and go talk to their customers. I think that is probably the most important thing, give or take, that a CEO can be doing. So it doesn't bother me that a CEO is involved with sales. Now, should they be on the customer success calls and grinding it out and running all of the analytics? Perhaps not, but showing that TLC to your customer, to me, goes a very, very long way. Because at the end of the day, yes, we might be selling software or hardware-enabled software companies. You might be selling them some sort of widget. That widget is only as good as the people that are selling it, as far as I'm concerned. So, and it always begins and ends with the CEO. That is the face of the organization, whether you like it or not. Even though during COVID, we learned to sell and buy online primarily, I still think this is still a people business, and having the right people and the right CEO that can empathize with their customers and understand their customers and listen to their customers and give them what they want. And not only just give them what they want, but also a CEO who can be that visionary to take those inputs of their customer and then merge that and contrast that with what's happening in their industry and build that product in advance of the customer actually needing that. That specific widget, I think, is really that magic secret sauce. So it's a CEO that listens to their customers, hears what they're thinking about, listens to how they procure, listens to their budget cycles, but also can merge that and contrast that with what's happening in their industry and build a product accordingly. If you can put that together, then you should have something really, really exciting on your hand. And then being able to communicate that to your team to go build it in advance of the customer needing it, and then giving it to your sales team to be able to sell it to them. That is really what the job of the CEO is on a day-to-day basis, I think. And then dealing with people like me in the background.
I think that's a great summary, and I think it's helpful because just hearing, the first thing you said, going through three sales teams by the time they talk to you is, a lot of people really cling to their first sales team.
No, cut quick.
This guy, he was there at the beginning. I can't
cut quick if it's not working.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to do the first time. By the time you've done it once or twice. We've
all been there, myself included. It's not easy to fire people. It's probably the hardest thing that almost any CEO will ever have to do. These are human beings. We're all human beings at the end of the day. We all have lives and need to pay the rent just like everybody else, kind of thing. So it's not an easy thing to do, but at the end of the day, it's probably the best thing for the business to cut quick if it's not working. If the metrics aren't there, and obviously it can be a culture drag as well, and could create a baseline of culture that is really, really hard to expunge from a business. And so it's better to kind of, I think in my experience, cut quick and move on and try to find the next right person or people to step in.
Yeah, I could not agree more. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you wanted to cover?
The only question that I would maybe really think about, how do you create the alignment of interest between the investor and the management team, right? It goes back to my notion of over-communicating, both at the beginning of the conversation that you're having with a potential investor, to make sure that you can elucidate your vision in a very succinct time frame. Because I think a lot of investors will get teased off with a management team. Again, if they say, hey, Matt, we've got this great vision, and I think it's going to take me a year to build it, but that vision doesn't actuate, and or it takes them 5 years. And so you just lose the trust. You lose the interest of your investor. So I think having very specific milestones that you're going to achieve and communicating that to align yourself with your investor base and your shareholder base, I think is really, really important from day one.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what you said about honesty, right? Just doing what you said you were going to do. I think early on it's harder because you just don't know how long it's going to take, perhaps. But then just don't promise. Don't promise 6 months. If
we're all in it together. Sure,
right? Say, hey, it's going to be a while, and that it's great to hear that the honesty is more appreciated than the over promising. The standard questions: 3 best practices you wish every founder would do, and you may have actually already answered this with honesty and communication. But anything else? Are there 2 others, or are you just sticking with the honesty and communication?
I mean, it's hard to top those in my books, but the other thing that I would add is just, I call my CEOs chief cheerleading officers. I love CEOs who on one hand can get on stage and rally the troops and rah sis kumbaya and be that cheerleader and express the vision to their 500, 5,000 employee staff, whatever it is. And everyone leaves that going, wow, that was awesome. I love that on one hand. And then on the other hand, a CEO who is an absolute animal in the unit economics and is very metric driven. So those are hard qualities to find in a human being who can do both. But when I think you can find a CEO who, again, listens to their customers, can rally the troops, but can also be very, very analytical with their data on the unit economics, the KPIs, the OKRs of the business. If you can find that in one human, that's a good CEO in my books.
That's great. That's very helpful. Last question. What's the best advice that you ever got?
Yeah, again, going back to sort of like this notion of, can you pay me back? Very, very great advice. And then the other one early in my career was, and again, I've shared this with many people, is here in Toronto, we have streetcars. And my old boss said to me, he goes, Matt, investments are like streetcars. You can see one come in and chase after it and race to the corner, and you can get to the corner, and we call them conductors, the streetcar driver will pull away. And you missed it. But don't worry, just stand on the corner. There'll be another one coming by in a few minutes. In other words, be patient. Be patient. Don't have FOMO. There'll be another one coming down the road, whether it's in 2 minutes from now or in 2 years from now. Just be patient. So I think just having patience with applying your best attitude. And then my personal advice is that I've never believed that I'm smarter than anybody, like ever. But the one thing that I can't control my level of intelligence, I don't think. But what I can control is my ethic and my work ethic. And so for me, my whole mantra has always been about putting my best, most honest foot forward always. That's how I live my life, full stop. And I figure if I live that way, good things will happen down the road. So that would be, I think, the best advice that I kind of was given as a young kid, but also how I effected it over my career too. So that would, I think, is pretty good. Those are good things that I live by.
That's great. Let's go out on that. So how can people reach you? What's, the fund's website or LinkedIn? What's the best way to get in touch with them?
Best thing is just LinkedIn. I respond to pretty much everything. That's another lesson that I learned. One of the best companies I've ever invested in, actually the best company I've ever invested in, the CEO, reached out to me on LinkedIn back in 2014 or 2015, something like that. And because I don't think most people will respond to random, people reaching out, but I did. And here we are. And that company is, now a multi unicorn kind of thing. And is done exceptionally well and will continue to do well. So it taught me never ignore. You never know what's going to be under every rock that you upturn. So you just never know. So I am very open. It obviously helps if you come through a trusted connection. If we'd have a mutual connection that reaches out on your behalf, that certainly goes a very long way. And my policy is that if you're reaching out to me, certainly from a friend or a friend of a friend kind of thing, then I will always try to pay it forward. If it's not a right fit for us, I will do my best to help any CEO or any person that reaches out to me to try to help them or help them wayfind or steer them in the right direction or make another one or two intros. I'm a big advocate of doing that. And, I think that's really important for people like me to do.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I really appreciate your time today, Matthew. Thank you for joining us. And we'll post LinkedIn and the fund's website in the show notes so people can find them. But thanks again. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.